I just wanted to take a few moments out going through Revelation to deal with some of the usual arguments that are put against those of us that are into futurism, that somehow we've been deceived by the Jesuits. And the reason I want to do this is because the allegation has long been around that to take the heat off the papacy being called Antichrist by Protestants around the world, the Jesuits, the Society of Jesus as they're called, were given the task to somehow take the spotlight off the papacy and put it onto a future man of sin. And this was done, it is alleged, by reinterpreting the scripture to suggest that a future character would come on the scene, and this future character would be the Antichrist. And because some of us hold to futurism, we've somehow fallen prey to this elaborate Jesuit hoax. Now, the reality is that most Christians in the UK don't hold to futurism. That's the first thing I want to say. Secondly, we always go to the scripture. I was talking to a man on the street yesterday, I think it was, giving out tracts, and we were talking about many different subjects, and he was giving out his tracts and I was giving out my tracts, and he didn't believe in eternal security, and he said to me that the early fathers didn't believe in eternal security. And I said to him, you don't want to be going with the early fathers, because a lot of the early fathers had some very strange views. I think it was Origen who mutilated himself in light of Matthew 5 because he couldn't stop lusting. Another father said that Satan would be saved, and another one said that Jesus was inferior to the Father. So a lot of these early church leaders weren't as orthodox as we have been led to believe. Luther called them church babies, and I said to this chap, we need to check everything in light of scripture. Now, he didn't know about these fathers, and whether or not he'll do his own research is not clear. But whether this is an elaborate hoax from the Jesuits or not is actually irrelevant, because the Bible does teach a future man of sin. And if you saw the last video, you will know what I'm referring to. I also want to say something else along this line, that if we accept the allegation that we've somehow been deceived by powers to be, then I feel we do a great disservice to those that have gone before us. And I'm thinking of somebody like John Nelson Darby. For those that don't know, John Nelson Darby was a bishop in the Church of Ireland, and he had an accident one day, and during his period of recuperation he got into the scriptures and discovered Bible prophecy, something which he had never really paid much attention to before. In fact, probably had no need to. No doubt he was raised with replacement theology and millennialism, as most of these high churches are. And the more he got into the Bible, the more he realized the rapture would occur before the tribulation. He saw Jacob's trouble and 1,000-year reign. Now, at the time, we can't say that nobody had this belief, but we would argue that Darby rediscovered the rapture and the 1,000-year reign. Now, we know from church history that a man called Ephraim in the 7th century believed that Christ would come back for his church before the tribulation, and there's a reference in his writings to being caught up, the church being caught up, I should say. And we certainly know that the early church leaders, right up and including Eusebius, held to 1,000-year reign. But Eusebius left that belief, went off to millennialism, and Augustine, I think, was also a pre-millennial believer at one stage, but he too left it and took on the belief of millennialism. And I've touched on that briefly on another video which will be going online pretty soon. If we go back just a couple of hundred years prior to Darby, we have the back end of the Reformation, and we have Luther, Calvin, and some of the other guys rediscovering sola fide and sola scriptura. And I think what we can say with all honesty, is bit by bit, generation by generation, the Lord reveals more things to more people over a period of time. I remember talking to an old brother about the gap theory, and I personally am not swayed that there is a gap theory, but I'm probably on the fence, so persuade me if you will. But this brother put an interesting point across to me, that the gap theory was discovered or rediscovered, as he would have it, during the time of Darwinism, and the gap theory does allow the Earth to be older than it actually is. Now, personally, I don't think we need the gap theory to deal with Darwinism or even the age of the Earth, but he was convinced that its rediscovery during the time of Darwin allowed the church at the time to deal with Darwinism. Now, like I say, I don't think we need it, but in his mind, he was convinced that's what it was for. It was there for a purpose. These guys, whether it's Darby or Luther or whatever, they did go through the scriptures, and certainly in Luther's day, he was probably the first to really go through the scriptures and find a whole lot of things which he'd never seen before. And I think it's also fair to say that Darby had been raised in a church system and had missed an awful lot of Bible. I know when I first got saved and I started to read the Bible, I was amazed at what I hadn't seen and didn't know. And I wasn't raised from I hadn't come from a clerical background. I was just a member of the laity. But imagine the shock if you've come from a clerical background, and you are hearing all these things for the first time. So what I want to say is this: let's not give the Jesuits too much credit. It's easily done, and the Bible is going to be our final authority. It has to be. And if you're not going with the scriptures, if you're not checking everything line by line, precept upon precept, then you may well buy into this Jesuit theory. And if you do, then it's your loss, because there are two parts of eschatology which need to be kept in mind. Paul, for example, was writing to his initial audience, the New Testament churches, and he was also speaking to the church age, which came on the back end of that, but he was also talking to those in the tribulation. And let's not start slicing up the scriptures and taking out bits here and bits there and eisegeting the scripture when we should be exegeting the scripture. And let's stop giving the Jesuits and the Dominicans and the flat earthers and the vegetarians and the Hindus and the Buddhists and all the other guys any credit, and let's just stay with the scripture, and the Lord will show us what he wants us to see.